Welcome back, HSM. I'm excited to be with you. Kevin Liebig, Central Student Pastor, and we are going to dig into Acts chapter 2 tonight. But before we do that, let's jump into a time machine. Let's go back a few years to a little thing that I like to call the COVID pandemic. Do you remember what that was like? How awesome that was when all of a sudden schools shut down. You couldn't go outside and be with your friends. You had to isolate. That was a fun time, wasn't it? I remember just how lonely it felt to be unable to see my friends, to go out, to be with people, and how strange it felt to be isolated. And that feeling of isolation and loneliness is such a hard thing to experience, and it's not something that a pandemic causes. We can feel isolated and alone. And in fact, it's one of the things that many of us experience. A couple of statistics that I found is that nearly half of all 10 to 12-year-olds report feeling lonely. But when you get to high school age, that rises to 60%. 60% of 16 to 24-year-olds feel lonely some of the time, and a full 10 to 15% feel it often. We live in a world that feels very connected. We have our phones, we have social media, we have more access to people all the time, and yet there are times that we feel isolated and alone, and we long for that sense of community that is deeply built into each and every one of us. Someone has said, often I hear this a lot, we are social creatures. Humans are social creatures. God created us to be in community. And if you think about that word community, a lot of things come to mind about togetherness and doing things with your friends and being social. But community is a word that we talk a lot about, even in the church. But we don't really know what that means. And so that's why we want to spend the next couple of weeks talking about what does it mean to have community, specifically community in the church. I mean, the fact that you guys are in a house right now, in a small group, shows you that we as a church value community. But we also want to equip you and empower you to have community among your friends. Because if you don't know what ingredients or what factors go into biblical community, you may not actually experience it even in the church where you are supposed to feel it to the fullest. So I want to pause real quick and I want to send this discussion question to you guys. First is, how would you define community? If you were going to say that word community, how would you define that? And secondly, what does that look like in your life, or what does that look like among your friends? Okay, we're back. So some of you may have had very different definitions of community. Some of you may have different aspects of community that you think. We all know that we have a desire to belong and to be with one another. But today we're going to talk about this really core feature, is that community actually takes intentionality. Community takes intentionality. I want to open up to one of the passages in Scripture that is probably the one that is thought about the most when we think about the description of the early church and the community that they felt. So we're in Acts chapter 2, starting in 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any who had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. We often see this passage and we think this is what the church could be. Having all these aspects together, who wouldn't want to be a part of a church where we shared everything, we worshiped together, we prayed together, all that kind of stuff. I know I would. And often we think of this as something that we compare church with as opposed to something that we pursue with intentionality. So here's some things that I want to say. I want to point out where it talks about intentionality. So the first thing it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayers. We talk about intentionality. The early church, devoted themselves. They devoted themselves. When I think of the word devoted, it means they made an intentional decision to act in a certain way. The greatest lie about community and friendships and any sort of togetherness is that it has to happen organically, that if it doesn't happen organically, then it's not really true community. That a relationship, a boyfriend or girlfriend or a marriage has to be this organic, lovey-dovey feeling for it to be true or not. That if we have to work for it, then it's not really true community. But that's not the case at all. The early church devoted themselves, meaning they made a decision to attend to certain things. And what did they devote themselves? It says they devoted themselves to the disciples' teaching and to prayer and to breaking bread and to fellowship, all those things. They devoted themselves to the practices of pursuing Jesus. It wasn't that they just devoted themselves to one another over a sense of shared inside jokes, or that they had the same hobbies, or that they cheered for the same team, or that they liked a certain brand of clothing. This isn't this loosely affiliated group of people. They were dedicated and devoted intentionally to one another because they knew that they were united in Jesus. So they had a biblical community on this core principle that we are pursuing Jesus together. So you have to, if you want to create community, you have to be intentional with one another, and you have to be intentional with one another with the pursuit of Jesus. But that's not what I see in most friendships, because we like to stay on the surface. We don't like to bring God, even among believers, we have a hard time bringing God into this, but you have to be intentional and make a decision to be devoted to the things of Jesus together. It says the second thing that they did was they sold their possessions. They sold their possessions and distributed it among those needs. And I love that because it says they prioritized generosity toward one another. This isn't the generosity that happens in like a school lunchroom where your friend says, can I have your bag of chips or whatever. This is intentional. They see a need, meaning they had to have relationship with one another enough to know who was in need, and then they decided to sacrifice themselves to meet the needs of other people. That means you can't just show up and be in community, that there is some intentional sacrifice of your own needs for the sake and the benefit of others. Many of us see community as something that we get, a feeling that we get, or a benefit that we get, but the early church demonstrated that we have to be intentional with meeting the needs of other people. The next thing, it says that day by day, they met together. And so they devoted themselves to the disciples' teaching. They had a shared biblical purpose. They sold their possessions. They prioritized generosity of their time and energy. And then they prioritized time together. So picture this. The church at this time, this was after Jesus' resurrection, there were about 3,000 members of this church. In a town, Jerusalem, which we think of as a big town, was really 25,000 people. That means that 3,000 believers in this town. There were more members of Christ Chapel among all three of our campuses than there were members of this early church. But it was still significant. And you have to prioritize being with others. And so they chose time with one another. And what I see a lot in our ministry is that oftentimes the people that feel the most disconnected are the ones that don't prioritize time with their community. Now, I'm not here to shame you into church attendance, although I think church attendance matters. And I'm not here to shame you about whether or not you should be coming to your small group more or less. That's not the point. The point is you get out of what you put into your time with other believers. And you can't expect to experience community if you're not willing to prioritize time. I know you're busy. I know you have sports, you have homework, that many of you have work, extracurricular activities, that it is hard to prioritize community. But if you don't prioritize it, you will not experience the full blessings of it. And I really do think that if you did an audit of your time and looked at the way that you spent your time, there are many places where we waste time, whether that's on our phones, doing things that don't really matter to the kingdom, and we sacrifice time with other believers for those other time wastes. So I want to think about this. It says that they devoted themselves to the teaching. They prioritized generosity. They prioritized time together. And it says that God added to their number every single day. So I want to pause real quick and just ask the question, why do you think a community that looked like this was so attractive to the world around them? What made this community so attractive? And even us today, what makes this so attractive that many people look at this passage as an ideal of the church to strive for? Okay, we're back. I hope that discussion was good, because I look at that passage and I look at what the disciples did, and I think I would love to be a part of something like that. Which begs the question, where do we go from here? If it takes intentionality, where does it go from here? I think the first question I would love to ask you guys is, are you waiting for somebody else to create that community for you? If you look around the room in your small group right now, in your home group, you'll have leaders. And oftentimes we believe that it's the job of the leader to organize the community and to create the ingredients for true community to happen. But it's not their responsibility. It's your responsibility. Are you waiting for somebody else? Are you waiting for somebody else to organize a hangout? Are you waiting for somebody else to reach out for you? Or are you willing to be intentional about the time that you spend and the purpose by which you spend it? Okay, the second thing is, community is more about what you do and less about how you feel. The thing that I see them a lot is when we go into community, and if we don't feel the vibe, if we're not walking in going, oh, this sounds great, or this feels awesome, or I feel totally loved or accepted or seen or whatever, we go, this is not the community for me. And we look at Acts chapter 2, and it's more about what they did. They were intentional about their time, their goals, their aim, their generosity towards one another. It was more about that than what they got out of it. And the same thing is true with you. If you seek community, if you pursue it, it's not about what you get out of it, it's about what you contribute to it. So are you thinking about what you receive out of community more than what you are going to put in? And then the last thing I want you to think about is, if you want biblical community, you're going to have to sacrifice for it. You're going to have to make it a big deal and prioritize it and invest in love in other people, even when it's not easy, even when it requires extra time of you, even when it means saying no to other things. But the goal is that you would become more like Jesus. It's not that you would primarily feel the sense of joy or experience or whatever, but if you want to pursue it, if you want to have community, you're going to have to sacrifice for it. And so maybe one of the questions you should think about in your home group is, how am I willing to be intentional to sacrifice for the community that I want? So I'll leave you with this. The big idea is that those who experience community, biblical community, God-ordained togetherness, are the ones who create biblical community, meaning you are the ones who create the reality of community for you. God is brought into it, but it happens by intentionality. If you don't get anything else from this entire talk, is you have to seek it out, you have to prioritize it, you have to sacrifice for it, and the benefits are that you have a common goal of learning about Jesus, growing deeper in your love for him, and becoming more like him every single day. I hope this passage opens your eyes to the joys of community, and that for the next couple of weeks, we get a deeper sense of what community means in your home group. So go off and do the rest of your questions, and we'll see you next week.